Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into the mysterious idea of quantum consciousness, the possibility that your mind may be connected in some subtle and hidden way to the very fabric of the universe itself. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a gentle reminder that even as we drift into these deep questions, we're all sharing this moment from different corners of the same vast universe. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and allow your body to settle into whatever position feels most comfortable. There's nothing you need to solve tonight, nothing you need to remember. Just listen, and let the ideas drift past you like slow-moving clouds. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it wander. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. Tonight we begin with something very simple, and yet perhaps the deepest mystery of all, the feeling of being you. There is a moment, just before you fall asleep, when the world begins to soften. The edges of things blur, thoughts become slower, less urgent, and somewhere in that quiet space you can still feel it, the simple, undeniable sense that you're here. Not as a concept, not as a name, but as an experience. Right now, as you listen to these words, there is something it feels like to be you. You can notice the gentle rhythm of your breathing, the weight of your body resting against the surface beneath you, perhaps the faint awareness of your surroundings, even if your eyes are closed. And behind all of that, there is a kind of inner presence, a quiet knowing. This presence does not announce itself loudly. It doesn't need to. It is simply there, constant, familiar, almost so obvious that we rarely stop to question it. But if you pause for just a moment and turn your attention inward, a strange question begins to emerge. Why does this experience exist at all? Why is there something it feels like to be you instead of nothing? You see, your body is made of matter. At the smallest scales, it is built from tiny particles, atoms, even smaller components beneath those. These follow the same physical laws as everything else in the universe, the same laws that govern stars, oceans, and distant galaxies. And yet, a star does not feel like anything. A rock does not experience itself. Even the most advanced computer, processing vast amounts of information, does not seem to possess this quiet inner life. This sense of I am here, and still, somehow, you do. You don't just process the world, you experience it. When you hear a sound, it is not just a vibration entering your ear. There is a quality to it, a tone, a texture, a feeling. When you remember something, it is not just data being retrieved. There is a sense of reliving, of meaning, of emotion gently attached to the memory. And when you simply sit in silence, aware of your own thoughts, there is something even more subtle happening. You are aware that you are aware. This layering, this depth, is what makes consciousness so mysterious. Because if we try to describe it from the outside, it begins to slip through our fingers. We can talk about neurons, tiny cells in the brain that send electrical signals. We can describe how these signals form patterns, how different regions of the brain activate when you see, hear, or think. But none of that explains the feeling. It doesn't explain why those patterns of activity are accompanied by an inner world, by colours, sounds, emotions, and sensations that are experienced from within. Imagine, for a moment, a perfectly designed machine. It has sensors that detect light, sound, and touch. It processes information, makes decisions, even speaks in a way that sounds human. From the outside, it behaves exactly like a person, but inside, there is no experience, no sense of warmth, no feeling of colour, no quiet awareness observing it all. It is just processes without presence. Now compare that to your own experience. When you see the colour red, for example, there is something it feels like. Not just a wavelength of light, but a vivid, immediate sensation. This difference between processing information and actually experiencing it is one of the deepest puzzles in science. It suggests that something about consciousness goes beyond simple computation, that perhaps there is another layer to reality, one that is not easily captured by the usual language of physics and biology. And this is where our journey gently begins to shift, because for many years scientists believed that if we understood the brain well enough, if we mapped every neuron, every connection, the mystery would eventually disappear. Consciousness would be explained as a complex but ultimately ordinary process. But the more we learn, the more it seems that something is missing. It is as if we are describing the shape of a flame without ever touching the warmth. And so, some researchers have begun to look in a different direction, not by abandoning science, but by expanding it, by asking whether the answer to consciousness might lie not only in the large-scale activity of the brain, but in the smallest, most subtle layers of reality itself. Layers where the rules are different, where particles can exist in many possibilities at once, where connections can stretch across space in ways that seem almost impossible, where the act of observation itself appears to play a role in shaping what becomes real. This is the world of quantum physics, and while it may seem distant, abstract, even strange, there is a growing idea that these hidden processes might not be confined to distant laboratories or tiny particles. They might be happening quietly inside you, in the delicate structures of your brain, in the silent rhythms beneath your thoughts, in the very fabric of the awareness you're experiencing right now. For now, you don't need to fully understand it. Just let the idea settle gently, that this feeling of being you, this quiet presence behind your thoughts, might not be an isolated phenomenon, but part of something deeper, something woven into the structure of reality itself. And as your mind grows quieter, listening, breathing, drifting, we'll slowly begin to explore what that might mean, not all at once, but step by step, like following a soft trail through the dark, where each idea appears just as you're ready to receive it. There is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that you are aware at all. Not just that your brain processes information, not just that it reacts, predicts, and responds, but that it feels like something to be you. If you gently bring your attention back to this moment, you might notice it again. The soft presence behind your thoughts, the simple sense that you are here, experiencing. And yet, when we try to explain this experience using science, something unusual happens. The explanation seems to stop, just short of the most important part. For many years, scientists have studied the brain with remarkable precision. They can observe how different regions become active when you see a colour, when you hear a sound, when you remember a face, or feel an emotion. They can trace signals as they travel through networks of neurons, measure electrical patterns, even predict to some degree what someone might be thinking or perceiving. From the outside, it is an impressive picture, a dynamic, intricate system, alive with activity. But there is a quiet gap in this picture, because none of these descriptions explain why any of it should feel like anything from the inside. This puzzle has a name, though we will approach it gently. It is often called the hard problem of consciousness. The phrase was introduced by a philosopher named David Chalmers, who noticed something simple, yet profound. There are many problems about the brain that are difficult, but still, in principle, explainable. For example, we can ask, how does the brain recognize faces? How does it store memories? How does it control movement? These are sometimes called the easy problems, not because they are actually easy, but because they involve functions we can study, measure, and gradually understand. We can observe the mechanisms, we can build models, we can test them. But the hard problem is different. It asks a question that feels almost slippery. Why is there something it feels like to have those processes at all? Why does seeing the colour red come with a vivid inner sensation, instead of being just a mechanical detection of light? Why does pain hurt, rather than simply triggering a reaction? Why does any of this have an inequality, an experience? To understand how strange this is, imagine a machine again, a very advanced one. It has cameras that detect light, sensors that detect pressure, internal systems that analyze patterns and respond intelligently. It can even speak, describing what it sees and feels in a way that sounds convincing. From the outside, it might appear almost identical to a human being, but inside, there is no experience, no colour, no sound, no feeling, just processes unfolding, silently. Now consider yourself. When you see a colour, it is not just data. There is a richness to it. A presence. A quality that cannot easily be reduced to numbers or signals. Philosophers sometimes use a gentle term for this. They call it qualia. But rather than thinking of it as a technical word, you can simply think of it as the feel of experience, the redness of red, the warmth of sunlight, the quiet sadness of a memory. These are not just functions, they are lived moments, and this is where the mystery deepens. Because if you describe everything happening in the brain, every neuron firing, every signal passing, you still have not explained why those processes should be accompanied by experience. It is as if we have a complete map of a city, every street, every building, but no explanation for why the city feels alive when you walk through it. Some scientists have suggested that consciousness might simply emerge when the brain becomes complex enough. That if you have enough neurons, enough connections, awareness somehow appears. But this idea, while intuitive, leaves something unresolved. It tells us when consciousness might arise, but not why. It is like saying that when enough instruments play together, music appears, without explaining why those sounds should become something meaningful, something felt. And so, over time, some researchers have begun to wonder, what if the explanation is not just about complexity? What if something deeper is involved? Something woven into the structure of reality itself? Because when we look closely at the brain, we see electrical signals, chemical exchanges, patterns of activity. But when we look closely at the universe, at its most fundamental level, we begin to see something else. A layer of reality where things are not fixed and definite, but exist in possibilities, where outcomes are not determined in advance, but emerge from a range of potential states, a layer where the act of observation seems to matter. This is the domain of quantum physics, and while it may seem far removed from your everyday experience, there is a growing sense that it might hold clues to this mystery. Not because it magically solves the problem, but because it introduces something new, a way of thinking about reality that is not purely mechanical. In classical physics, the world is often described like a clock. Each part moves according to clear rules, and if you know the starting conditions, you can, in principle, predict everything that follows. But in the quantum world, things are softer, less fixed, more open. Instead of one definite outcome, there can be many possibilities, existing together until something happens that brings one of them into focus. And this idea, this gentle openness, begins to echo something about consciousness itself. Because your experience is not just a fixed stream of events, it is selective, focused, shaped by attention. At any moment there are countless sensations, thoughts and possibilities around you, but only some of them enter your awareness. It is as if your mind is quietly choosing, or perhaps revealing, a particular version of reality from many possibilities. And this raises a delicate question. Could it be that consciousness is not just a byproduct of brain activity, but somehow related to this deeper layer of reality? Could the reason we cannot explain experience using classical science be that we are looking in the wrong place? That the answer might lie not only in neurons and signals, but in the subtle underlying structure of the universe itself? For now, we don't need to answer that question. It is enough to sit with the mystery, to notice that despite everything we know about the brain, despite all the progress of science, the simple fact of experience remains unexplained. And perhaps that is not a failure of science, but an invitation to look deeper, to explore new ideas, gently, carefully, without rushing to conclusions, because sometimes the most profound truths are not found by forcing answers, but by learning how to ask better questions. And as you rest here, listening, drifting a little further into that quiet space between thought and sleep, we can begin to turn our attention, slowly, toward that deeper layer, a layer where reality behaves in ways that are softer, stranger, and perhaps more connected to your experience than it first appears. If you were to gently imagine your brain, not as something abstract, but as something alive and quietly active inside you right now, it might feel a little like a vast, softly glowing city. Billions of tiny cells, each one sending signals, receiving signals, forming patterns that shift and flow from moment to moment. These cells are called neurons, and each neuron communicates using small pulses of electricity, followed by tiny releases of chemical messengers that drift across microscopic gaps, passing information from one cell to the next. It is a process that happens continuously, silently, without you needing to think about it. When you hear a sound, certain pathways become active. When you see an image, others respond. When you remember something, yet another pattern emerges. From the outside, this is a remarkable system, and over the past decades, scientists have become increasingly skilled at observing it. They can place sensors on the scalp and detect faint electrical rhythms, gentle waves that rise and fall as the brain shifts between states. They can use imaging techniques to see which regions of the brain are more active during different tasks, like a map lighting up in response to thought. They can even study individual neurons, watching them fire in response to specific stimuli. And through all of this, a picture begins to form. A picture of the brain as a highly complex network, processing information in ways that are both structured and dynamic. It is natural then to think, perhaps consciousness is simply what this system does. Perhaps if we understand the patterns deeply enough, we will understand experience itself. But as this picture becomes clearer, something curious happens. The closer we look, the more detailed the map becomes, the more obvious it is that something is still missing. Because even if we could describe every signal, every connection, every fluctuation in activity, we would still be describing the outside of the process. We would know what is happening, but not what it feels like. It is a little like studying a piece of music by analysing the vibrations of air. You can measure the frequency, the intensity, the timing of each note. You can reconstruct the entire waveform with perfect precision, but none of that tells you what it feels like to hear the melody. None of it captures the emotion, the atmosphere, the subtle sense of movement that arises when you listen. In the same way, describing brain activity, no matter how detailed, does not seem to capture the inner experience that accompanies it. And this realization has led scientists to an important distinction. There is a difference between the correlates of consciousness and the cause of consciousness. Correlates are patterns that appear alongside experience. For example, when you see something, certain visual areas of the brain become active. When you feel pain, specific networks respond. When you become aware of something, there are measurable changes in brain rhythms. These are reliable, repeatable, observable, but they are correlations. They tell us when this happens in the brain, this experience tends to occur. They do not tell us why this activity feels like anything at all. And this is where classical science, as powerful as it is, begins to reach its edge. Because classical physics, the framework that has guided science for centuries, describes the world in terms of objects, forces, and interactions. Things move, collide, exchange energy. Everything follows clear rules. If you know the state of a system, you can in principle predict what happens next. It is a world of certainty, of continuity, of cause and effect unfolding step by step. And this framework has been extraordinarily successful. It explains how planets move, how machines work, how electricity flows. It even explains many aspects of the brain, how signals travel, how chemicals interact, how networks form. But when it comes to consciousness, something feels incomplete, because classical physics describes systems from the outside. It tells us how things behave, not how they're experienced. It is like watching a dancer from a distance, seeing every movement clearly, but never feeling the rhythm from within. And so, as researchers continue to study the brain, a quiet tension remains. On one hand, we have an increasingly detailed understanding of neural processes. On the other, we still do not know why those processes should give rise to experience. Some have suggested that this gap may never be fully closed, that consciousness might simply be a fundamental feature of certain complex systems, something that appears when conditions are right, without needing further explanation. But others have taken a different path. Instead of accepting the gap, they have begun to question the framework itself. They have asked, what if the limitation is not in our understanding of the brain, but in the way we are thinking about reality? What if classical physics, for all its strengths, is not the full story? Because when we look deeper into the fabric of the universe, beyond the level of everyday objects, we find that reality behaves in ways that are very different from what classical intuition would suggest. At very small scales, the rules begin to change. Certainty gives way to possibility. Instead of definite states, systems can exist in a range of potential conditions at once, instead of isolated objects. There can be connections that stretch across space in ways that do not fit into ordinary ideas of distance. And perhaps most intriguingly, the act of observation seems to play a role in how these possibilities become actual outcomes. This is not something you need to fully understand right now. It is enough to sense that beneath the familiar surface of reality, there is a deeper layer, a quieter layer, where the rules are softer, more fluid, less fixed. And this realization has led to a gentle but profound shift in thinking. If consciousness cannot be fully explained within the classical picture, then perhaps it is connected in some way to this deeper layer, not as something separate from the physical world, but as something that arises from its most fundamental structure, something that is not added on top of matter, but woven into it at the smallest scales. For now, we are standing at the edge of this idea, looking out without rushing forward, because this is where the journey becomes both more uncertain and more beautiful. We're no longer just asking how the brain works. We're asking what reality itself might be at its deepest level, and how, somehow, from that depth, the simple, quiet experience of being you emerges. So as you continue to rest, letting your thoughts slow down, you might imagine that beneath the steady rhythm of your breathing, beneath the gentle flow of your thoughts, there is another layer working silently, not loud, not obvious, but present. And as we move forward, we will begin to explore that layer, slowly, carefully, letting each idea unfold just as softly as the last. As your thoughts begin to slow and your attention softens just a little, we can gently step into a different layer of reality, not far away, not somewhere distant in space, but deeper, beneath the surface of everything you already know. Imagine for a moment that the solid world around you, the bed beneath you, the walls of your room, even your own body, is not quite as solid as it seems. At everyday scales, things feel stable, predictable. Objects stay where they are. Causes lead to effects in clear, orderly ways. But when scientists began looking closer, much closer, into the smallest building blocks of matter, they discovered something unexpected. Reality, at its deepest level, does not behave like a collection of solid objects. It behaves more like a field of possibilities. This is the world described by quantum physics, and while the word itself might sound technical, the ideas can be felt more easily than they can be calculated. So instead of thinking in terms of equations, we can think in terms of gentle images. Let's begin with one of the most curious ideas. The idea that something can exist in more than one state at the same time. Imagine flipping a coin. In the ordinary world, the coin lands either heads or tails. But while it is spinning in the air, there is a brief moment where it is not yet one or the other. It is in motion, open, unresolved. Now, in the quantum world, this kind of openness is not just a fleeting moment. It can persist. A system can exist in multiple possibilities at once, not as a blur, but as a real combination of potential outcomes. Scientists call this superposition, but you can simply think of it as a state of many possibilities, coexisting gently together, not competing, not collapsing immediately, just present. Another idea follows naturally from this. If possibilities can exist together, then systems can also become connected in ways that go beyond ordinary distance. Imagine two tiny particles, created together, linked in some subtle way. Even if they drift far apart, something about their connection remains. If one changes, the other reflects that change instantly, not through a signal travelling through space, but through a deeper kind of relationship. This is often called entanglement, but again, you can think of it more simply as a kind of invisible harmony. Two parts of reality, moving as one, even when separated. These ideas begin to reshape how we think about the world. Instead of isolated objects, we start to see relationships. Instead of fixed states, we see possibilities, and instead of certainty, we find something softer, a kind of openness, waiting to become definite. But there is another piece to this puzzle. and it is perhaps the most intriguing. In the quantum world, something special seems to happen when a system is observed, when one of those many possibilities becomes a single, definite outcome. Imagine again the spinning coin. In the classical world, it simply lands. But in the quantum world, the transition from many possibilities to one outcome is not just a mechanical process, it is something deeper, something that scientists are still trying to fully understand. It is often described as a kind of collapse, where a range of possibilities gently resolves into a single reality. And this raises a quiet question. What causes that transition? What brings something from possibility into actuality? There are different ways to think about this. Some suggest that interaction with the environment is enough, that the world itself nudges possibilities into definite states. Others wonder whether the act of observation, in some form, plays a role. We don't need to settle that question right now. It's enough to notice that at the deepest level of reality, things are not fixed in the way we once imagined. They are fluid, responsive, open. And this begins to echo something we touched on earlier. Your experience is not a fixed stream. At any moment there are many things you could notice, many thoughts that could arise, many sensations that could come into focus, but only some of them appear in your awareness. It is as if your mind is gently selecting or revealing a particular version of reality from a wider field of possibilities. Now, this does not mean that your thoughts control the universe, or that reality is simply imagined. The physical world still follows consistent patterns. The bed beneath you remains stable. Gravity continues to hold you in place. But at a deeper level, the foundation of that stability is not as rigid as it seems. It is built from processes that are flexible, probabilistic, quietly shifting beneath the surface. To make this more tangible, imagine a vast landscape covered in mist. Within that mist there are many possible paths, but only one path becomes visible as you walk, not because the others disappear, but because your movement brings one into clarity. In a similar way, the quantum world can be thought of as a landscape of possibilities, where specific outcomes emerge from a broader range of potential. And this perspective opens a door to a different way of thinking about consciousness. Because if reality itself contains this layer of possibility, this openness, this gentle transition from many to one, then perhaps consciousness is not separate from it. Perhaps the feeling of experience, the sense of awareness, is somehow related to this process, not as something outside of physics, but as something that emerges from its deepest patterns. For a long time, these ideas were considered too delicate to exist in living systems. After all, the brain is warm, active, full of movement and noise. It seems like the kind of place where subtle quantum effects would quickly fade away. And for many years, that is exactly what scientists believed. But as research continued, a surprising picture began to emerge. Nature, it turns out, has ways of preserving these delicate processes, even in complex environments. And if that is true, then the possibility opens slowly, gently, that the same kinds of processes we see in the quantum world might also be unfolding quietly within the brain, not in a dramatic or obvious way, but subtly, softly, as part of the hidden layer beneath your thoughts. For now, you don't need to hold all of this in your mind. Let it settle, like a faint impression, a sense that reality is deeper than it appears, that beneath the solid surface of things, there is a quieter world of possibility, connection, and emergence. And as the moment opens gently around you, breathing slowly, letting your awareness drift, we will begin to explore how nature itself has learned to use these hidden rules, and how life, in its own quiet way, may already be touching the quantum world. As your thoughts begin to soften, letting your body grow heavier, your thoughts a little slower, we can linger here for a while longer in this quiet space where reality begins to feel just a little less solid than it once did. Because the deeper scientists looked into the quantum world, the more they noticed something unusual. Not just that reality behaves differently, but that it behaves in ways that feel almost unfamiliar to our everyday intuition. Let's return for a moment to a simple image. Imagine a narrow wall with two small openings cut into it. Behind the wall, there is a screen. Now imagine that you gently release tiny particles, one at a time, toward the wall. In an ordinary world, you might expect each particle to pass through one opening or the other, leaving a simple pattern on the screen behind. Two openings, two paths, two clusters of marks. But when scientists performed this experiment at very small scales, something unexpected happened. Instead of forming two simple clusters, the particles created a pattern of light and dark bands, like gentle ripples overlapping on water. A pattern that suggests something wave-like, something spread out, rather than a single definite path. It is as if each particle, somehow, explored both openings at once, not by splitting in half in the way we might imagine, but by existing in a state that allows multiple possibilities to unfold together. And then, something even stranger appeared. When the experiment was adjusted so that the path of each particle was carefully observed, the pattern changed. The soft ripple pattern disappeared, and in its place, the simple, expected pattern returned, as if the act of observing, of asking which path did it take, gently nudged the system into a more definite state. Now, we can approach this carefully. It does not mean that human attention magically controls particles, but it does suggest something subtle, that the way a system is measured, the way information about it is gathered, plays a role in how it behaves. And this is one of the quiet mysteries at the heart of quantum physics. The idea that reality, at its smallest scales, is not entirely independent of how it is observed. You might think of it like this. Imagine standing in a dimly lit room, filled with faint outlines of objects. Until you turn your attention towards something, it remains vague, undefined. But as you focus, it becomes clearer, not because it suddenly appears, but because your attention brings it into sharper form. In a very gentle and abstract way, something similar seems to happen in the quantum world. Possibilities exist, softly, until interaction or measurement brings one of them into focus. Now, alongside this idea, there are other behaviours that feel just as unusual. For example, there is a phenomenon often described as tunnelling. In everyday life, if a ball rolls toward a hill that is too steep, it simply stops. It does not pass through the hill. But at the quantum level, particles sometimes behave differently. They can appear on the other side of a barrier, even when they do not have enough energy to cross it in the usual way. Not by breaking the rules, but because at that scale, the rules themselves allow for a kind of gentle leak through possibilities. Again, it is not something you need to calculate or visualize precisely. It is enough to sense the pattern. Reality, at its deepest level, is not rigid. It allows for subtle transitions, for unlikely paths, for outcomes that would seem impossible from a purely classical perspective. And then there is the idea of uncertainty. In classical physics, if you know everything about a system, its position, its motion, you can predict its future with precision. But in the quantum world, there is a natural limit to how precisely certain properties can be known at the same time. The more clearly you define one aspect, the less sharply another can be pinned down. It is not due to a lack of measurement tools. It is built into the structure of reality itself, a gentle reminder that at the deepest level, the universe is not entirely fixed. It contains a softness, a space for possibility. Now, as these ideas began to take shape, scientists initially assumed that they only applied to very small systems, isolated and carefully controlled. After all, the everyday world appears stable, predictable. A chair remains a chair, a body remains a body. So it seemed natural to believe that these delicate quantum behaviors would vanish in larger, more complex systems, that they would be washed out, smoothed over by the noise and activity of the environment. And for a long time, this seemed to be the case. But slowly, patiently, a new line of research began to emerge. Scientists started to ask, what if some systems, especially living ones, have found ways to preserve these subtle effects? What if nature, through countless iterations, has learned to use these gentle rules rather than eliminate them? And this is where the story begins to shift again, from particles to life, from abstract physics to the processes unfolding quietly within living systems, because it turns out that in certain conditions, nature does not simply suppress quantum behavior, it harnesses it. For example, when plants capture sunlight, the energy does not wander randomly through the system. Instead, it seems to explore multiple pathways at once, finding the most efficient route, almost as if it is trying out different possibilities simultaneously. In a similar way, some animals appear to sense the Earth's magnetic field using processes that may involve subtle quantum effects, allowing them to navigate vast distances with remarkable precision. These discoveries suggest something gentle but important, that the boundary between the quantum world and the living world is not as sharp as we once believed. That life, in its quiet complexity, may already be interacting with this deeper layer of reality, and if that is true, then the question naturally arises, could the brain, the organ that gives rise to your thoughts, your memories, your sense of self, also be engaging with these hidden processes? Could the very thing we are trying to understand, consciousness itself, be connected in some subtle way to this deeper, softer layer of reality? For now, we're not answering that question. We're simply letting it take shape, letting it rest, gently, alongside the feeling of your own awareness. Because as you lie here, breathing slowly, noticing the quiet presence of your experience, it is possible that beneath all of it, there are processes unfolding that are far more delicate and far more intricate than they first appear. Processes that do not follow the rigid rules of classical physics, but instead move through a landscape of possibilities, quietly, patiently, shaping the reality you experience, one moment at a time. And as we continue, we will begin to see how life itself has learned to use these hidden rules, not in theory, but in practice. As your breathing settles into a gentle rhythm and the edges of your thoughts soften just a little more, we can turn our attention to something quietly remarkable. For a long time, it was assumed that the strange, delicate behaviors of the quantum world could only exist under very special conditions, extremely low temperatures, carefully isolated environments, systems protected from disturbance. In other words, places very different from the living world, because life, as we know it, is warm, active, full of motion and interaction. And from a classical point of view, that kind of environment should quickly wash away any subtle quantum effects, smoothing everything into ordinary, predictable behavior. But as researchers began to look more closely, something unexpected began to emerge. Nature, it seems, has found ways to work with these quiet rules, rather than eliminate them. Let's begin with something simple, a leaf. Resting quietly on a branch, absorbing sunlight. At first glance it appears calm, almost still, but within that leaf, a complex process is unfolding. Light from the sun is captured and transformed into energy that the plant can use. This process is called photosynthesis. For many years, scientists described it using classical ideas, energy moving step by step, following a fixed path through the system. But when they looked more closely, they noticed something surprising. The energy did not seem to take just one path. Instead, it behaved as if it were exploring many possible paths at once, briefly sampling different routes, before settling into the most efficient one. Not in a conscious way, not as a decision, but as a natural consequence of how possibilities can coexist at small scales. It is as if the system is gently feeling out its options, allowing the most efficient outcome to emerge. This kind of behavior is difficult to describe using only classical physics, but it becomes more natural when we think in terms of superposition, that soft state of many possibilities existing together. In this context, the leaf is not just absorbing light, it is quietly making use of the deeper flexibility of reality itself. And this is not the only example. There are certain birds, small, delicate creatures, that migrate across vast distances. They travel thousands of kilometers, often returning to the same location year after year. And they do this with a precision that is difficult to explain using only classical senses. Some researchers have suggested that these birds may be using a kind of internal compass, one that is sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field, but not in a purely mechanical way. Instead, it may involve subtle processes within specialized molecules, processes that allow tiny components to remain linked, responding together to the surrounding field. A quiet coordination, shaped by the same kind of deep connection we described earlier. Again, this is not something the bird is aware of. It is simply part of how its biology functions. But it suggests that living systems can maintain delicate relationships, even in environments that seem too noisy or too active. And there are even hints that our own sense of smell may involve similar subtleties. Rather than recognizing scents only by their shape, some theories suggest that molecules may be identified by the way they vibrate, through interactions that are sensitive to very small differences, as if the body is not just detecting structure, but sensing patterns at a deeper level. Now we can approach all of this gently. These ideas are still being explored. They are not all fully settled, but taken together, they point towards something important. The boundary between the quantum world and the living world is not as strict as we once believed. Life does not simply exist on top of physics, it is shaped by it, at every level. And sometimes it appears to make use of the more subtle aspects of that foundation. This realization opens a quiet door, because if plants, birds, and even simple biological systems can preserve and use these delicate processes, then perhaps the brain, with all its complexity, might also be capable of something similar. After all, the brain is not just a collection of neurons, it is a living system, evolved over millions of years, shaped by countless interactions with the environment. It has developed ways to process information, to adapt, to respond, in ways that are both efficient and flexible. So it is not unreasonable to wonder, could it also be working, at least in part, with these deeper rules? Could there be processes within the brain, subtle, hidden, operating beneath the level of ordinary electrical activity, that make use of this quiet layer of reality? For many years, the answer seemed to be no. The brain was considered too warm, too active, too noisy. Any delicate quantum effects, it was thought, would quickly fade away, lost in the constant motion of the system. But as we've seen, nature has a way of surprising us. The leaf, quietly capturing sunlight, the bird finding its way across continents. These are not fragile systems, yet they appear to sustain processes that were once thought impossible in such environments. And so, the question begins to shift, not from, is it possible, but to how might it be happening? What structures within living systems allow these processes to persist? What mechanisms protect them, stabilize them, or guide them? And most importantly, so just what role might they play? Because if these processes are present in the brain, then they may not be random or incidental. They may be part of something deeper, part of how information is organized, how patterns are formed, perhaps even how experience itself arises. For now, we are not making any strong claims. We're simply noticing a pattern, a quiet thread that runs from the smallest scales of physics into the living world, and possibly into the workings of the mind. And as you rest within this quiet moment, letting your awareness drift, you might sense that this thread is not something distant or abstract. It is part of the same reality that gives rise to your thoughts, your sensations, your sense of being here. A reality that is not fixed and rigid, but alive with possibility, softly unfolding, moment by moment. And as we move forward, we will begin to look more closely at the brain itself, not just as a network of neurons, but as a place where these deeper processes might quietly take shape. As your thoughts drift a little more slowly, and your body settles deeper into stillness, we arrive at a quiet turning point in our journey. Up to now, we've been gently circling a question. Why does consciousness exist at all? We've seen how classical science can describe the brain in remarkable detail, mapping signals, patterns, and activity, yet still leaving something essential unexplained. We've also stepped into the quantum world, where reality becomes softer, more open, shaped by possibilities rather than fixed outcomes. And now, these two paths begin to meet, not in a loud or dramatic way, but through an idea that at first seemed almost too unlikely to take seriously, an idea that consciousness might not arise only from classical processes in the brain, but from something deeper, something quieter, something quantum. This idea began to take shape through the work of two very different thinkers. One was a physicist, a man deeply immersed in the mathematics of the universe, named Roger Penrose. The other was a medical doctor, an anesthesiologist, someone who spent his days studying how consciousness can be gently turned off, and then allowed to return, named Stuart Hameroff. From the outside, their worlds could not have been more different. One explored black holes, geometry, and the deep structure of reality. The other worked with patience, observing how awareness fades and reappears under carefully controlled conditions. And yet, they shared a quiet intuition that something about consciousness did not fit neatly into the classical picture. Penrose, in particular, had been thinking about the limits of computation. He wondered whether human understanding, especially the ability to grasp abstract truths, might go beyond what a purely algorithmic system could achieve, not in a mystical sense, but in a way that suggested the brain might be doing something more than just following fixed rules. At the same time, Hameroff was observing something equally puzzling. In the operating room, consciousness could disappear reliably when certain substances were introduced into the body, and yet the mechanisms behind this loss of awareness were not fully understood. it was not simply that the brain shut down. Much of its activity continued. Signals still moved, regions still interacted, and yet the experience, the inner presence, was gone. This raised a subtle question. What exactly is being affected when consciousness fades? What's the difference between a brain that is active and a brain that is aware? When Penrose and Hameroff began to exchange ideas, they found a surprising overlap, a possibility that the answer might lie not in the large-scale activity of neurons, but in much smaller structures hidden within them, structures that could, in principle, support the kinds of delicate processes we associate with the quantum world. Their proposal came to be known as Orchestrated Objective Reduction, a name that sounds technical, but can be approached more gently. You can think of it like this. Imagine that within the brain, there are tiny systems quietly exploring many possible states at once, not in a chaotic way, but in a coordinated, structured manner. And then, at certain moments, these possibilities resolve into a single outcome, a kind of gentle settling from many options into one. Each of these moments, they suggested, might correspond to a moment of conscious experience, not a continuous stream, but a series of subtle transitions happening in rapid succession, like individual notes in a melody, blending so smoothly that they feel like a single flow. What made this idea unusual was not just that it involved quantum processes, but that it placed those processes at the very heart of consciousness. Instead of seeing awareness as something that emerges from classical computation, it suggested that awareness might arise from the way possibilities become actual, at the deepest level of reality. A process that is not entirely determined, nor entirely random, but something in between. Now it's important to approach this idea gently. When it was first proposed, many scientists were skeptical, and for good reason, because the brain, as we have seen, is not an easy place for delicate quantum processes to survive. It is warm, active, full of interaction, the kind of environment where subtle states might be expected to fade almost instantly. And yet, the idea did not disappear. It lingered, not because it had been proven, but because it offered a different way of thinking, a way of bridging the gap between physical processes and subjective experience. Instead of asking, how do neurons create consciousness? It asked, what if consciousness is linked to how reality itself becomes definite? What if the brain is not just processing information, but participating in a deeper process, one that connects it to the underlying structure of the universe? This does not mean that the brain is a magical device, or that it defies physical laws. Rather, it suggests that the laws themselves, at their deepest level, may already contain the seeds of awareness. That consciousness is not something added on top of matter, but something that emerges when certain conditions are met within the fabric of reality itself. And if that is true, then the brain may not be the origin of consciousness in the way we usually imagine. It may be more like a place where consciousness becomes organized, focused, expressed. A place where deeper processes take on the form of experience. Now, we're still at the beginning of this idea. We have not yet explored where these processes might occur or how they might be structured. We have not yet looked inside the neuron, or into the tiny components that Penrose and Hameroff believed might play a role. For now, it is enough to sit with the possibility that the feeling of being you, the quiet awareness behind your thoughts, might not arise solely from electrical signals and chemical exchanges, but from something more subtle, something that touches the same layer of reality where possibilities exist, before they become definite. And as you notice the quiet presence behind your thoughts, letting your attention soften, your thoughts drift. we can begin to move closer to that place, not in a rush, but slowly, gently, looking inside the neuron, not as a static structure, but as a living space where something unexpected might be unfolding. As you settle a little deeper, letting the words arrive and pass without effort, we can move closer now, not outward into the vastness of space, but inward into something very small, so small in fact that it exists quietly inside the cells of your brain, inside each neuron, beneath the electrical signals and chemical exchanges we've already touched upon. There is a delicate internal structure, a kind of hidden framework that gives the cell its shape, supports its function, and helps transport tiny components from one place to another. These structures are called microtubules, but rather than holding onto the word itself, you might imagine them as tiny hollow scaffolds, long slender tubes, woven through the interior of each neuron, like the beams of a quiet, intricate architecture. At first glance, they seem simple, just part of the cell skeleton, providing support, maintaining form, and for many years, that is exactly how they were understood. But as scientists began to look more closely, a different possibility began to emerge. What if these tiny structures are doing more than just holding the cell together? What if they are also involved in processing information, not in the familiar way of electrical signals passing along neurons, but in a more subtle, deeper way? To understand this idea, let's return for a moment to something we've already touched upon: the quantum world, where systems can exist in many possibilities at once, where connections can stretch across space, and where outcomes gently emerge from a field of potential. Now, imagine that within these tiny hollow structures, there are components arranged in a regular repeating pattern, small building blocks lined up in a way that allows them to interact, not just mechanically, but in ways that are sensitive to very small changes. Each of these building blocks can be thought of as having different possible states, not simply on or off, but capable of shifting between subtle configurations, and when many of them are arranged together, they form a kind of network, a network that, in principle, could support patterns of activity, not unlike the larger neural networks we usually think about, but operating at a much smaller scale, a quieter scale, a scale where the boundaries between definite states and possibilities begin to blur. The proposal made by Penrose and Hameroff was that these microtubules might act as a kind of internal processing system, not replacing the familiar activity of neurons, but complementing it, adding another layer beneath the electrical signals. In this view, the brain is not just a network of neurons firing, it is also a system where tiny internal structures may be exploring possibilities in a coordinated way. And here, it becomes helpful to soften the idea even further. Rather than imagining a quantum computer in the technical sense, you can think of it as a space where many possibilities are gently present at the same time. A space where patterns can form, shift, and settle, without needing to follow a single, fixed path. Now, one of the most important questions is this: how could such delicate processes survive inside the brain? As we've mentioned before, the brain is warm, active, full of interaction. It does not resemble the quiet, controlled environment where quantum effects are usually observed. And this is where the idea becomes more subtle. Some researchers suggest that the structure of microtubules themselves may help protect these processes, that their shape, their arrangement, their internal environment might create conditions where certain patterns can persist just long enough to have an effect. Not for long periods, not in a dramatic or obvious way, but for brief moments that may still be meaningful You might imagine it like a small pocket of stillness within a moving river, a place where the flow slows just enough for something delicate to form before it gently dissolves again. Now, these microtubules are not isolated. They are connected through the larger structure of the neuron and through connections between neurons. There are even tiny junctions where neighbouring cells can influence one another more directly, allowing patterns to spread and coordinate. This opens the possibility that these small-scale processes are not happening independently, but are part of a larger orchestrated pattern, a coordination across many tiny structures, contributing to the overall activity of the brain. And this word, orchestrated, is important, because it suggests that these processes are not random. They are organised, timed, aligned in some way, with the larger rhythms of neural activity. So instead of thinking of the brain as a single layer of activity, you might imagine it as having multiple layers. A surface layer, where electrical signals move, where information is processed in familiar ways, and beneath that, a quieter layer, where possibilities are explored, where patterns form and dissolve, where something more subtle may be taking place. Now we are still speaking in possibilities. These ideas are not universally accepted. They are part of an ongoing exploration, a careful attempt to understand whether such processes truly occur, and if they do, what role they might play. But even as a possibility, they offer something valuable, a new way of looking at the brain, not just as a machine, processing inputs and outputs, but as a living system, interacting with the deeper structure of reality. And if that is the case, then consciousness, the feeling of being you, might not arise solely from large-scale activity. It might also be shaped by what happens in these tiny hidden spaces. Spaces where the distinction between what is and what could be becomes less clear. As you rest here, listening, letting the ideas drift without effort, you might imagine that within your own brain, there are layers of activity unfolding, some familiar, some less visible, all working together, quietly, seamlessly, to give rise to the experience you're having right now. And as we move forward, we will begin to explore what happens when these subtle processes come together, not just as isolated events, but as a rhythm, a sequence of moments that may form the very flow of consciousness itself. As your body grows a little heavier, letting each thought arrive and fade like a slow tide, we can now bring these ideas together, gently, into something more complete. So far, we've explored a possibility that within the brain, there may be tiny structures quietly supporting subtle processes where many potential states can briefly exist together, and that these processes, rather than being random, may be coordinated, aligned with the activity of the brain as a whole. Now we take a small step further, not a leap, just a soft extension of the idea. What if consciousness itself is not continuous in the way it appears? What if the smooth, flowing sense of awareness you feel is actually composed of many tiny moments, occurring one after another, so seamlessly that they blend into a single experience? To begin to sense this, imagine watching a film. On the screen, everything appears fluid. People move naturally. Scenes shift smoothly. There is no sense of interruption. But behind the scenes, the film is not continuous. It is made of individual frames, still images, shown in rapid succession, each one slightly different from the last. When these frames are played quickly enough, the mind does not see them as separate. It experiences them as motion, as flow. Now, the idea proposed by Penrose and Hameroff suggests something similar, but at a much deeper level. They propose that consciousness might arise from a series of discrete events, moments where a range of possibilities gently resolves into a single outcome. Each of these events is not something you notice directly. They are too small, too brief, but together they may form the continuous stream of awareness you experience. Instead of a constant, unbroken flow, consciousness might be more like a sequence of soft transitions, each one a quiet selection, where one possibility becomes actual, while others fade away. And these moments may occur many times each second, not in a way that feels mechanical or rigid, but in a rhythm, a subtle, ongoing pulse. You might imagine it like the flicker of candlelight. At first glance, the flame appears steady, but if you look closely, it is constantly shifting, moment by moment, never exactly the same, and yet the overall impression remains continuous. Now, to bring this closer to experience, think about how your attention moves. Even in this moment, your awareness is not fixed. It shifts gently from the sound of your breathing to the sensation of your body to the meaning of these words. Each moment slightly different from the last, and yet it feels like a single, unified experience. The idea here is that beneath this flow, there may be tiny transitions happening, moments where the brain moves from a state of possibility into a state of experience, not all at once, but again and again in a quiet rhythm. Now, in the Orchestrated model, these moments are linked to the behavior of the microtubules we discussed earlier. Within those structures, patterns of activity may build up, exploring different possible configurations. And then, when a certain threshold is reached, there is a transition, a gentle settling from many possibilities into one outcome. This is sometimes described as a kind of collapse, but rather than thinking of it as something abrupt or forceful, you can imagine it as a soft resolution, like a chord in music that moves from tension into harmony. Each of these moments, they suggested, corresponds to a moment of conscious awareness, not the entire experience, but a single note in the larger melody of consciousness. And when these notes occur in rapid succession, they create the impression of continuity, of presence, of being. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of this idea is that these moments are not entirely determined, nor are they completely random. They exist in a kind of middle space, where possibilities are explored, and then one outcome emerges. This introduces a subtle form of openness, a space where the future is not fully fixed in advance, but gently shaped as each moment unfolds. And this may have implications, not just for how we experience the world, but for how we act within it. Because if each moment of awareness involves a transition from possibility to actuality, then your experience is not simply being replayed, it is being formed, moment by moment. Now, it is important to remain grounded here. This does not mean that your thoughts can instantly reshape the external world. The larger structure of reality still provides constraints, patterns that remain stable over time, but within those patterns, there may be room for subtle variation, for selection, for emergence, a quiet interplay between what is possible and what becomes real in your experience. Now let's return to something we touched on earlier, the unity of consciousness, the fact that despite being generated by billions of separate processes, your experience feels like one thing, one moment, one field of awareness. If consciousness is made of these tiny transitions, these discrete events, then something must be coordinating them, aligning them, binding them together into a coherent whole. And this is where the idea becomes even more interesting. because the same kind of deep connection we saw in the quantum world, the kind that allows separate parts to behave as one, may also play a role here, allowing different regions of the brain, different processes, to contribute to the same moment of awareness, not as separate pieces, but as aspects of a single, unified experience. Again, we are speaking gently. These ideas are still being explored. They are not settled conclusions, but they offer a different way of thinking, a way of seeing consciousness not as a continuous substance, but as a process, a rhythm, a sequence of quiet events unfolding beneath your awareness, and as you lie here, listening, drifting, you might begin to sense something subtle, that your experience, though it feels smooth and continuous, is always changing, always renewing itself, moment by moment, like waves on water, each one rising, forming, dissolving, and giving way to the next, and yet the surface remains calm, unified, whole. And as we continue, we will begin to explore how these moments, these subtle transitions, might leave traces, clues, signals that can be observed, studied, and perhaps understood. As your body settles a little deeper and the quiet rhythm of your breathing continues, we can turn towards something both familiar and quietly revealing: sleep, or more precisely, the gentle fading of awareness. You may have noticed this before. In your own experience, there's a moment, not always easy to pinpoint, when the world begins to slip away. Sounds soften, thoughts become less defined, and then, without any clear boundary, awareness disappears. Later, it returns. You wake, and the sense of being you is back, continuous, as if nothing had happened. But something did happen. Something changed within the brain. And for scientists trying to understand consciousness, this change has become one of the most valuable clues, because unlike many other aspects of the mind, this transition can be studied, not just in sleep, but in controlled conditions, through anesthesia. In a medical setting, certain substances can be introduced into the body, and within moments, awareness fades, not gradually, as in natural sleep, but more directly, more reliably. And yet, when researchers observe the brain during this process, something curious appears. The brain does not simply shut down. Electrical activity continues. Signals still move. Many processes remain active. From the outside, the system is still working. And yet, the experience is gone. The inner presence, the quiet sense of being, disappears. This raises a subtle and important question. What exactly is being affected when consciousness fades? If awareness was simply the result of overall brain activity, then reducing that activity should explain everything. But that is not what we see. Instead, it appears that certain patterns, certain kinds of organization are disrupted, while others continue. Now, in recent years, some researchers have begun to look more closely at how anesthetic substances interact with the brain at a very small scale, not just at the level of large networks, but within the internal structures of neurons. And here, something interesting begins to emerge. Certain anesthetics appear to interact with the microtubules we discussed earlier, those tiny hollow structures inside neurons, the ones that were once thought to serve only a structural role. These substances can bind to components within the microtubules, subtly altering how they behave, not destroying them, not removing them, but gently interfering with their internal dynamics. Now, we can approach this carefully. The idea is not that microtubules are the only thing affected by anesthesia. The brain is a complex system, and many processes are involved. But the possibility arises, that these tiny structures may play a role in maintaining the conditions needed for consciousness, and when their internal patterns are disrupted, awareness fades. You might imagine it like this: a piece of music played by many instruments. If one instrument becomes slightly out of tune, the melody may still be recognizable, but if a certain underlying rhythm or coordination is disturbed, the entire experience changes, not because the sound has stopped, but because something essential to its coherence has been lost. In a similar way, anesthesia may not stop the brain from functioning, but it may disrupt the subtle coordination, the deeper layer of activity that gives rise to experience, and this leads to a quiet but powerful idea. That consciousness may have a kind of signature, not in the sense of a visible mark, but as a pattern, a way in which different parts of the brain are aligned, coordinated, working together in a particular way. Some researchers have even suggested that this signature may involve a form of coherence, a gentle synchronization across different parts of the system, not rigid, not perfectly uniform, but enough to allow information and perhaps experience to move as a unified whole. When this coherence is present, awareness is possible. When it is disrupted, awareness fades. And this brings us back, in a subtle way, to the ideas we explored earlier. The idea that beneath the surface of neural activity, there may be deeper processes at work, processes that are not purely classical, not entirely fixed, but involve patterns that can form, persist briefly, and then dissolve. If such patterns are involved in consciousness, then anesthesia may offer a window into how they function. By gently disturbing them, we can observe what happens when they are no longer able to sustain their role. Now, it is important to remain balanced here. These ideas are still being explored. The relationship between microtubules, quantum processes, and consciousness is not fully established. There are many open questions, many alternative explanations, and careful research is ongoing. But even as a possibility, this line of inquiry offers something valuable, a bridge between theory and observation. Because for a long time, discussions about consciousness remained largely philosophical, difficult to test, difficult to measure, but anesthesia changes that. It provides a way to move from awareness to non-awareness in a controlled, repeatable way, and in doing so, it allows us to look for patterns, to ask, what changes when experience disappears? What remains? What is lost? And perhaps most importantly, what does that tell us about the nature of consciousness itself? As you rest here, letting your awareness drift gently, you might notice something subtle, that your experience right now feels stable, continuous, present. But this stability is not guaranteed. It depends on the delicate balance of processes within your brain, processes that are constantly shifting, adjusting, maintaining the conditions needed for awareness, and if those conditions change even slightly, the experience can fade, not as a failure, but as a natural transition, a reminder that consciousness is not a fixed object, but a process, something that arises, is sustained, and can gently disappear. And as we continue, we will look more closely at the signals, the experiments, the hints that researchers have found, as they try to understand what lies beneath that process. As you remain in this quiet space, where thoughts come and go without effort, we can move a little closer to the edge of what is currently known, not beyond it, but right up to that boundary where observation meets uncertainty and where science begins to ask softer, more careful questions. Because once the idea emerged that consciousness might involve deeper processes, possibly even subtle quantum-like patterns. Researchers began looking for signs, not proof, not certainty, but signals, clues, small indications that something unusual might be happening beneath the surface of the brain's activity. And over time, a few such clues have begun to appear. One of the areas scientists have explored is the behaviour of those tiny structures we've discussed, the microtubules. Rather than treating them only as structural supports, researchers have asked whether they might show patterns of activity that are more coordinated, more delicate than expected. In some experiments, light or other forms of gentle probing are directed into these structures, allowing scientists to observe how they respond. What they found in certain cases is that the internal activity of these structures does not always behave like a simple, random system. Instead, there are moments, brief, subtle, where patterns seem to persist longer than expected. Not for long, not in a way that is easily visible, but long enough to suggest that something is maintaining a degree of order, a degree of coordination within the system. You might imagine it like a ripple in water. Normally a ripple fades quickly, it spreads, loses energy, and disappears. But under certain conditions, the ripple can persist a little longer. Not forever, but just enough to be noticed. And this persistence, however brief, becomes interesting, because it hints that the system is not entirely chaotic, that there may be mechanisms, structures, or interactions helping to sustain these patterns. Now, we must remain very gentle here. These observations are not definitive. They do not prove that the brain is operating as a quantum system in the way some theories suggest. They are small, early, and still debated, but they open a door. They suggest that the brain may be capable of supporting more subtle forms of organisation than classical models alone would predict. Another line of research looks at how different parts of the brain coordinate with each other. When you're aware, your experience feels unified. Seeing, hearing, thinking, all seem to belong to the same moment, and this requires a form of integration, a way for different regions of the brain to align their activity. Scientists can observe this at a larger scale, through patterns of synchronization, where different areas show similar rhythms. But some researchers have wondered whether there might also be deeper forms of connection, operating beneath these observable patterns. Very subtle correlations, difficult to detect, that link distant regions of the brain in ways that are not fully explained by classical communication alone. In a few experimental setups, researchers have reported signals that could suggest such correlations, not direct evidence, but hints, patterns that seem to align more closely than expected, as if different parts of the system are responding together in a coordinated way. Again, we approach this carefully. There are many possible explanations: noise, measurement limitations, unknown classical processes, and the scientific community remains cautious, as it should, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and at this stage, the evidence is not yet strong enough to draw firm conclusions. But what makes these experiments valuable is not that they provide answers. It is that they refine the questions. They help us ask more precisely, what kinds of patterns should we look for? If deeper processes are involved, how can we distinguish between classical coordination and something more subtle? What measurements would allow us to see not just activity, but the structure of that activity? In recent years, technology has begun to improve. More sensitive instruments, more refined methods, ways of probing the brain that are less invasive, more precise, able to detect smaller signals. And as these tools develop, the hope is that we may begin to see more clearly, not just whether these subtle patterns exist, but how they behave, how they change, how they relate to states of awareness and to states where awareness is absent. Because if there is a deeper layer to consciousness, it is likely to leave traces, not obvious ones, but patterns, correlations, shifts that can be observed if we know how to look. Now, as you listen, you might notice something about your own experience, that it feels whole, seamless, not divided into parts, even though it arises from countless processes working together. And this sense of unity, this coherence, is one of the key things researchers are trying to understand. Not just how the brain is active, but how it becomes unified, how it moves from many separate processes into a single experience, and whether this unity might be supported by mechanisms that go beyond classical interactions. For now, we remain at the edge, looking at the clues without rushing to conclusions, because this is how science moves forward, not by certainty, but by careful observation, patient questioning, and a willingness to explore what is not yet fully understood. And as the moment opens gently around you, letting the words settle without effort, you might sense that this edge, this boundary between what we know and what we're still discovering, is not something to be feared. It is a quiet place, a place where curiosity can exist without pressure, where ideas can unfold slowly, gently, without needing to be resolved all at once. And as we move forward, we will step into one of the most important challenges to these ideas, a challenge that asks, in a very direct way, whether such delicate processes could survive at all in the living brain. As you settle a little deeper into stillness, letting your body feel a little heavier, your breathing slow and steady, we come now to a quiet but important turning point. Up to this moment, we've been gently exploring a possibility. That consciousness, the feeling of being you, might be connected to deeper processes, perhaps even to the subtle layer of reality described by quantum physics. We've seen how life can sometimes make use of delicate patterns. We've considered how the brain might contain structures capable of supporting them, and we've looked at early experiments, small signals, hints that something unusual may be happening. But now we must pause, because there is a question, simple and direct, that stands in the way of all of this. A question that many scientists consider the most serious challenge to these ideas, and it is this: even if such delicate processes exist, could they survive inside the brain? To understand this challenge, let's return for a moment to the nature of the quantum world. We've described it as soft, open, filled with possibilities. But this softness comes with a kind of fragility. In order for multiple possibilities to exist together in a coordinated way, the system must remain undisturbed, not perfectly still, but stable enough for those possibilities to persist. If the system interacts too strongly with its surroundings, the delicate balance is lost. The possibilities resolve too quickly into a single outcome. This process is often referred to as decoherence, but rather than focusing on the word, you can think of it like this. Imagine a quiet reflection on the surface of a still lake. When the water is calm, the reflection is clear, stable, coherent, but if the surface is disturbed by wind, by movement, by ripples, the reflection breaks apart. Not because it has disappeared, but because the conditions that allowed it to remain clear are no longer present. In the quantum world, something similar happens. When a system is isolated, it can maintain its subtle patterns, but when it becomes entangled with its environment, when interactions increase, those patterns dissolve into more definite states. Now, this becomes a problem when we think about the brain, because the brain is not a still lake. It is more like a river, warm, active, constantly moving. Signals are passing, molecules are interacting, energy is flowing in many directions at once. From a classical point of view, this environment seems far too noisy, far too dynamic for delicate quantum patterns to survive, even for very short periods. And this is why many scientists remain skeptical. They argue that any subtle processes, if they do arise, would be disrupted almost instantly, that the conditions required for such patterns simply do not exist in the brain. This objection is not trivial. It is grounded in decades of research, in careful calculations, in a deep understanding of how quickly delicate states tend to dissolve under normal conditions. So if the theory of quantum consciousness is to be taken seriously, it must answer this question, not with speculation, but with mechanisms, with explanations of how such patterns could be protected, stabilized, or renewed within the environment of the brain. Some researchers have proposed possible answers. They suggest that certain structures, like the microtubules we discussed earlier, might create small pockets of relative stability, regions where interactions are structured in such a way that delicate patterns can persist just long enough to matter. You might imagine this like a small eddy in a flowing river. While the main current moves rapidly, there are places where the water slows, where patterns can form, where motion becomes more organized, not completely still, but stable enough for something subtle to take shape. Others suggest that these patterns may not need to last long, that even very brief moments, if coordinated across many parts of the brain, could be enough to influence the larger system, like many small sparks, appearing together, creating a visible glow. But these ideas, while intriguing, are still being explored. They are not yet confirmed, and this is why the question remains open, because the challenge is not just to show that such processes can exist, but to show that they can exist in the right way, at the right scale, and at the right times, to give rise to consciousness. And this is not easy. It requires not only observation, but careful measurement, precise experiments, and a willingness to question assumptions on both sides. Now, as you listen, you might notice something interesting, that this challenge, this tension, does not weaken the exploration. It strengthens it, because it brings clarity. It prevents us from drifting too far into speculation. It keeps us grounded, connected to evidence, attentive to detail, and in doing so, it allows the question itself to become more refined, more focused. Instead of asking, is consciousness quantum? We begin to ask, what kinds of processes could support consciousness? What conditions are necessary? What patterns must be present for awareness to arise? And these are questions that can be explored step by step through observation, through experiment, through careful thought. As you rest here, you might imagine the brain again, not just as a network of neurons, but as a dynamic landscape, a place where many processes unfold at different scales, in different layers, some fast, some slow, some obvious, some hidden, and within that landscape, there may be regions of stability, moments of coordination, patterns that form and dissolve, shaping the experience you have without ever becoming fully visible. Whether these patterns are purely classical or involve deeper processes remains an open question. But the search itself is already revealing something important, that consciousness is not simple, not easily reduced, not fully captured by any single perspective. It is a process, rich, layered, and still deeply mysterious. And as we continue, we will move from this challenge into something equally important: the question of how the brain creates unity, how all of its separate processes come together to form a single experience, a single moment of awareness. As you rest within this quiet moment, gently aware of your breathing, of the quiet space around you, we turn now towards something you experience every moment, but rarely notice: the unity of your awareness. Right now, you're not just hearing these words. You may also feel the weight of your body, the softness or firmness beneath you, perhaps the faint awareness of air moving across your skin. And all of these different kinds of information are arriving from different places, different sensory systems, different regions of the brain, each processing its own kind of signal, and yet you do not experience them as separate. You do not feel like a collection of disconnected fragments. Instead, it all comes together as one moment, one experience, one quiet field of awareness. This simple fact that your experience is unified has puzzled scientists for a long time, because from the outside, the brain does not appear unified in this way. It is distributed, complex, made up of many specialized regions, each handling different tasks. Some areas process visual information, others process sound, others track the body, memory, emotion. Each of these systems operates in its own way, often at different timescales, with different patterns of activity. And yet, somehow, all of this becomes one experience, not layered, not fragmented, but whole. This puzzle is sometimes referred to as the binding problem. But rather than holding onto the term, you can simply think of it as a question. How does the brain bring everything together? How does it take separate streams of information and create a single, unified moment? There are classical explanations. Some suggest that the brain uses synchronization, aligning the timing of activity across different regions, so that information arrives together. Others propose that certain central areas act as hubs, gathering and distributing information across the system. These ideas explain part of the picture. They show how information can be coordinated, but they do not fully explain the feeling of unity, the seamless quality of experience, the fact that seeing, hearing, and feeling do not just occur at the same time, but are experienced as part of the same moment. To explore this more deeply, let's return to a gentle image. Imagine listening to an orchestra. Many instruments are playing, each producing its own sound, its own tone, its own rhythm. From the outside, you could analyze each instrument separately. You could measure the vibrations, the frequencies, the timing. But when you listen, you do not hear separate streams. You hear a single piece of music, a unified experience. Now imagine if each instrument were completely independent, with no coordination. The result would not be music. It would be noise. What makes the orchestra work is not just that the instruments are present, but that they are connected in timing, in structure, in relationship. And this connection, this coordination, is what creates the unified experience. Some researchers have wondered whether something similar might be happening in the brain at a deeper level, not just through classical signals, but through more subtle forms of connection, forms that allow different parts of the system to behave as if they are part of a single whole. And here, the idea of entanglement returns in a very gentle way. Earlier we described entanglement as a kind of connection, where different parts of a system remain linked, even across distance. Now imagine, not particles, but processes within the brain, different regions, each handling different kinds of information. but connected in such a way that their states are not entirely independent, that what happens in one is reflected in the others in a coordinated way, not through signals travelling back and forth, but through a deeper form of alignment. If such connections exist, even briefly, they could provide a way for the brain to integrate information, not just in time, but in experience, to create moments where everything comes together as one. Now, we must remain careful. This is a possibility, not a confirmed mechanism. The classical explanations, synchronization, network dynamics, remain important and well supported. But the idea of deeper connections offers a way to think about unity, not just as coordination, but as a shared state, a moment where different processes are not just aligned, but part of the same underlying pattern. To make this more tangible, consider your own experience again. Right now, you are hearing these words. At the same time, you may feel your breath, your body, perhaps even the quiet emotional tone of this moment, and yet, you do not experience these as separate layers. You experience them as one continuous presence, one moment of being. It is as if your awareness is not divided, but gathered, centered, whole. Now imagine that beneath this, there are processes working together, not just through signals, but through shared patterns, forming and dissolving, moment by moment, each moment a kind of integration, a coming together of different aspects of the brain's activity. And if this is the case, then the unity of consciousness may not be something added on top, but something that emerges naturally from how these processes are connected. Not perfectly, not permanently, but just enough for each moment of awareness to feel whole. As you rest here, letting your thoughts slow, your attention soften, you might begin to sense something subtle, that your experience, though it feels continuous, is always being assembled, moment by moment, from many parts into one, like waves forming on the surface of water, each one shaped by countless interactions, yet appearing as a single smooth motion. And as we continue, we will explore how this process of forming and selecting experience might also shape something even more personal: your memories, your attention, the way your mind chooses what becomes part of your awareness, and what fades into the background. As your awareness drifts quietly, gently aware of the quiet rhythm of your breath, we can turn towards something even more familiar, something that moves softly through every moment of your life, your attention and your memory. Right now, out of everything that could be part of your experience, only a small portion is actually present. You're hearing these words, perhaps noticing the feeling of your body, the surface beneath you, the faint background of the room. But there is much more that could enter your awareness, the subtle sounds around you, the many thoughts that could arise, the countless details your senses are receiving, even now. And yet, only a few of these become part of your experience. It is as if your mind is quietly selecting, choosing, shaping what appears. Now we can think of this in a very gentle way, not as a deliberate decision, but as a natural process, a soft focusing, like a beam of light illuminating one area while the rest remains in shadow. This is what we call attention, and it is not fixed. It shifts, moves, flows from one thing to another, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, but always. It defines what becomes part of your conscious experience. Now let's connect this to something we explored earlier. The idea that, at a deeper level, there may be many possibilities present at once, many potential sensations, thoughts, interpretations, all available within the system. But only some of these come into focus. Only some become part of your awareness. You might imagine this like standing in a vast library, shelves upon shelves, filled with books, each one containing information, memories, possibilities. But you're not reading all of them at once. You select one, you open it, and in that moment, that story becomes your experience. Now, this image also helps us understand memory, because memory is not simply a storage system, like a file kept unchanged over time. Instead, it is something more fluid. When you recall a memory, you are not retrieving a perfect copy. You are reconstructing it, bringing together pieces, impressions, fragments, and forming them into a present experience. This is why memories can change, why they can feel slightly different each time they are recalled, because they are not fixed objects, but living patterns shaped by the present moment. Now, if we return gently to the idea of possibilities, we can think of memory as something that exists in a range of potential forms, different ways it could be recalled, interpreted, experienced, and when you remember, one of those possibilities becomes actual, not because it was the only one available, but because in that moment, it is the one that comes into focus. This is not a conscious choice in most cases. It happens naturally, quietly, without effort. But it reflects something important, that your experience, even your past, is not entirely fixed. It is shaped each time it arises. Now let's bring attention and memory together. At any given moment, your attention selects what becomes part of your present experience, and memory provides the patterns, the context, the meaning that shapes that experience. Together, they create the flow of consciousness, a continuous unfolding, where each moment is influenced by what came before and shapes what comes next. Now, in the framework we've been exploring, there is a gentle way to think about this. If the brain contains layers where many possibilities can exist, even briefly, then attention may be the process that brings one of those possibilities into experience, not by force, not by command, but by alignment, by focusing the system in a way that allows a particular pattern to become clear. You might imagine it like tuning a radio. There are many frequencies present all around you. But when you adjust the dial, one station comes into focus, not because the others disappear, but because your system is now aligned with that particular signal. In a similar way, attention may tune the brain towards certain patterns, allowing them to become part of awareness, and memory provides the content, the structure, the meaning that fills those patterns. Now, we must remain careful. This is a way of thinking, a model, not a proven mechanism, but it helps us see something important. That consciousness is not just something that happens to you, it is something that is continuously being shaped, moment by moment, through selection, through reconstruction, through the gentle interplay between possibility and experience. And as you lie here, listening, drifting, you might notice how your own attention moves. Perhaps it lingers on certain words, perhaps it wanders briefly to a thought, a memory, a sensation, and then returns. Each shift, subtle. Each moment, slightly different. And yet, the overall experience remains continuous, coherent, whole. Now imagine that beneath this flow, there are processes unfolding, selecting, shaping, integrating, quietly, without effort, without awareness of their own. Processes that allow certain possibilities to become your experience, while others remain in the background, unchosen, but still present. This does not make your experience less real. If anything, it makes it more dynamic, more alive, because it is not fixed, it is always being formed, always being renewed. Now, as we move forward, we will begin to expand outward again, not away from the brain, but beyond its immediate boundaries, toward the possibility that these processes, this subtle interplay between possibility and experience, may not be confined entirely within you, but may extend, in ways we are only beginning to explore, into the connections between minds, and perhaps into the deeper structure of reality itself. As you rest here, letting your awareness drift gently between the sound of these words and the quiet presence of your own body, we can begin to widen the view, not by leaving the mind behind, but by asking a softer question. Where does the mind truly end? For most of us, it feels natural to imagine that our thoughts, our awareness, our sense of self are contained entirely within the boundaries of the brain, inside the skull, separate from everything else. And at one level, this is clearly true. The brain is where signals are processed, where patterns form, where experience is organized. But as we look more closely, both at the brain and at the nature of reality itself, that sense of separation begins to feel a little less absolute, because earlier we explored the idea that at a deep level, reality is not made of isolated parts. It is made of relationships, connections, patterns that extend beyond simple boundaries. And if that is the case, then it becomes possible to ask, could the processes that give rise to consciousness also extend beyond the strict limits of the individual brain? Not in a dramatic or mystical way, but in subtle, quiet, and perhaps measurable ways. Let's begin with something very familiar: human connection. You may have noticed this before, a moment when you are sitting with someone, and without words, you begin to feel what they are feeling. A shared silence, a subtle shift in mood, a sense that something has changed, even if nothing has been said. Now, at one level, this can be explained through classical means: body language, facial expression, tone of voice. The brain is very good at reading these signals, often without conscious effort. But there are moments, small, fleeting, where the connection feels deeper, less about interpretation and more about alignment, as if two experiences, briefly, are moving together. Scientists have begun to explore this idea in a very careful way, by observing pairs of people interacting, speaking, or even simply sitting together, and measuring their brain activity at the same time. In some cases, researchers have found that certain patterns, certain rhythms, begin to align, not perfectly, not constantly, but enough to suggest that the brains are, in some sense, synchronizing. You might think of it like two pendulums, placed close together. At first they swing independently, but over time, subtle interactions cause them to fall into rhythm, not because one controls the other, but because they are part of the same system. Now, again, we remain grounded. These observations can be explained through classical interactions, shared environment, shared sensory input, common focus. All of these contribute to alignment, but they raise an interesting possibility that the boundaries between minds may be more fluid than we assume, that under certain conditions, systems can begin to coordinate, to resonate, to align in ways that go beyond simple cause and effect. Now, if we return gently to the deeper layer of reality, the one described by quantum physics, we recall that connections can exist. They're not limited by distance in the usual sense, that parts of a system can remain linked in subtle ways, even when separated. And while it would be too strong to claim that human minds are directly connected in this way, some researchers have wondered whether there might be faint echoes of such connections in the way biological systems interact. Not as direct communication, not as shared thoughts, but as a kind of sensitivity, a responsiveness to patterns that are not entirely local. Now, this is an area of active exploration and also of caution, because it is easy to move too quickly, to interpret small signals as something more than they are, and so the scientific approach remains careful, observing, testing, repeating, looking for consistent patterns. But even within this careful framework, a gentle idea begins to take shape. That consciousness, while clearly rooted in the brain, may not be entirely isolated, that it may be influenced, shaped, or even subtly extended through interaction with other systems, with other minds, with the environment, with the deeper structure of reality itself. Now let's bring this back to your own experience. As you lie here, listening, you're not completely separate from the world around you. You're in a room, surrounded by air, by sound, by subtle shifts in temperature. Your body is constantly interacting with its surroundings. Your senses are continuously receiving information, even when you're not focused on it. And your mind, your awareness, is shaped by these interactions, not as something imposed from the outside, but as part of a continuous exchange, a quiet dialogue between you and the world. Now imagine that this dialogue extends deeper, not just through classical signals, but through patterns, relationships, connections that are more subtle, more difficult to observe, but still present. This does not mean that you're dissolving into everything around you. Your individuality remains, your perspective remains, but it suggests that the boundary between self and world is not a hard line. It is a gradient, a soft transition. Now, as your thoughts continue to slow and your awareness becomes more diffuse, you might begin to feel this more directly, not as a concept, but as a sensation, that the space around you is not entirely separate from your experience, that the air, the sounds, the quiet background of the world are part of the same moment, the same field of awareness, and from here we can take one more gentle step toward a deeper idea, one that suggests that both consciousness and the physical world may arise from the same underlying structure, not as separate things, but as different expressions of a deeper layer of reality. As you remain here, quiet, steady, letting each breath come and go without effort, we can move one step further, not outward, not inward, but deeper. Because up to now we have been exploring a possibility. That consciousness may not be entirely separate from the physical world, but connected to it, shaped by it, perhaps even emerging from its deeper layers. Now we begin to ask a more subtle question. What if both consciousness and the physical world arise from the same underlying reality, not as separate things that interact, but as different expressions of a deeper structure? To approach this idea, we can gently introduce the work of a physicist named David Bohm. Bohm spent much of his life thinking about the nature of reality, not just as it appears on the surface, but as it might exist at a deeper level. And he proposed something that at first seems simple, but becomes more profound the longer you sit with it. He suggested that reality may have two layers, a visible layer and a hidden one. The visible layer is the one we experience every day. Objects, events, the flow of time. This is sometimes called the explicate order, the unfolded world, where everything appears separate and distinct. But beneath this, Bohm proposed a deeper layer, a more subtle order where everything is connected, enfolded, not yet separated into individual objects. He called this the implicate order. Now, rather than focusing on the terms, you can imagine it like this. Picture a calm ocean. On the surface, you see waves. Each wave appears separate. It rises, moves, and falls. You can point to one wave and say, "This is a wave," but beneath the surface there is only water, continuous, unbroken. The waves are not separate from the ocean. They are expressions of it, temporary forms, arising from a deeper unity. In a similar way, Bohm suggested that the objects we see, including our own bodies, may be like waves, surface expressions of a deeper, more unified reality. And if this is the case, then consciousness, too, may be part of that deeper layer. Not something that exists only inside the brain, but something that emerges when certain patterns form within this underlying structure. Now, this does not mean that your thoughts are spread across the universe, or that individuality disappears. The wave still has its shape, its motion, its identity. But it also remains part of the ocean. Now let's bring this back to something we explored earlier. The idea that at a deep level, reality is not made of isolated pieces, but of relationships, patterns, connections. If both matter and consciousness arise from the same underlying layer, then the relationship between them is not something added later. It is built in from the beginning. And this offers a different way of thinking about the hard problem we discussed earlier. Instead of asking, how does the brain create consciousness? We might ask, how does a deeper reality give rise to both the physical brain and the experience associated with it? In this view, the brain is not generating consciousness from nothing. It is shaping, organizing, focusing, a process that is already present at a deeper level, like a lens, bringing light into a particular form. Now, this idea may feel abstract, so we can return to something more immediate. Your experience right now. You are aware, not just of the words, but of the space in which they appear, the quiet background of awareness, in which thoughts come and go. Now imagine that this awareness is not something separate from reality, but part of the same underlying field that gives rise to everything else, not as an addition, but as an aspect, a way in which reality becomes present to itself. Again, we approach this gently. These ideas are not confirmed. They are part of a broader exploration, a way of thinking that connects physics, philosophy, and experience. But they offer something valuable, a sense of coherence, a way of seeing how the pieces might fit together without forcing a simple answer. Now, as you lie here, you might notice that your sense of self, your sense of being you, is not fixed in a single point. It shifts, it expands and contracts. Sometimes it feels centered in your thoughts, sometimes in your body. Sometimes it becomes more diffuse, more open, less defined. And this suggests something subtle, that the boundary of the self is not rigid. It is flexible, shaped by attention, by context, by the patterns unfolding within your mind. If consciousness is part of a deeper layer of reality, then this flexibility makes sense, because you're not a completely isolated system. You are a pattern, emerging within a larger whole. Now, we do not need to hold on to this idea tightly. It is enough to let it rest, gently, alongside your experience. A possibility, a way of seeing, that beneath the surface of things, there may be a deeper unity, a quiet order, from which both the world and your awareness arise. And as we move forward, we will take one more step toward a question that has been asked again and again in many different ways. Does consciousness, in some sense, participate in the unfolding of reality, not as a force that controls everything, but as something that plays a role, however subtle, in how possibilities become the world we experience? As your awareness drifts quietly, gently aware of the quiet rhythm of your breath, we arrive at one of the most delicate ideas in our journey. Not a conclusion, not a final answer, but a question that has quietly followed us from the beginning. What role does consciousness play in reality itself? Until now, we have explored the possibility that consciousness may arise from deeper processes, perhaps connected to the fundamental structure of the universe. But now, we turn the question slightly, not just where consciousness comes from, but whether it does something, whether it participates in the unfolding of reality. To approach this gently, we can begin with the work of a physicist named John Archibald Wheeler. Wheeler spent much of his life thinking about the strange behaviour of the quantum world and what it might mean for our understanding of reality, and he proposed an idea that feels both simple and quietly profound, that the universe is not something entirely separate from observation, but something that, in a subtle way, involves it. He described this as a participatory universe. Now, this does not mean that your thoughts create the world in any direct or personal sense. The stars do not appear because you imagine them. The Earth does not change its orbit based on your attention. The large-scale structure of reality remains stable, governed by consistent patterns, but at a deeper level, Wheeler suggested. The act of observation may play a role in how possibilities become actual events. To understand this, we can return briefly to something we explored earlier. In the quantum world, systems can exist in a range of possibilities until an interaction occurs and one outcome becomes definite. Now, in physics, the word observation does not necessarily mean conscious awareness. It can refer to any interaction, any process that brings about a definite state. But Wheeler raised a more subtle question. What if the distinction between observation and participation is not as clear as we think? What if the universe, at its deepest level, is not simply unfolding independently, but is in some sense responsive, not to individual thoughts, but to the presence of systems that can register, interact, and bring about definite outcomes? And consciousness, being one of the most complex forms of such a system, may be part of that process. Now, we must remain very careful here. It is easy to misunderstand this idea. It does not mean that consciousness controls reality. It does not mean that you can shape the external world through intention alone. Rather, it suggests something more subtle, that reality, at its deepest level, may not be fully formed in advance, that it contains possibilities, and that the unfolding of those possibilities involves interaction, participation. Now, to bring this closer to experience, imagine again that landscape we described earlier, a vast field of potential paths softly present. As you move, one path becomes clear, not because the others disappear, but because your movement, your interaction, brings one into focus. In this sense, you're not creating the landscape, but you are participating in how it is experienced. Now extend this idea gently to the structure of reality itself, at the smallest scales where possibilities exist. The processes that bring about definite outcomes may involve systems like the brain, systems that interact, register, and organize information in complex ways. This does not make consciousness the cause of reality, but it places it within the process, as part of the unfolding. Now, there is another way to think about this, one that may feel even softer. Instead of asking whether consciousness changes reality, we can ask whether reality includes consciousness, not as an addition, but as an aspect, a way in which the universe becomes aware of itself. Now, again, we remain grounded. This is philosophical interpretation. It is not a confirmed scientific conclusion, but it arises naturally when we consider the strange behavior of the quantum world and the mystery of consciousness together. Because if reality at its deepest level involves possibilities, and if consciousness is related in some way to how those possibilities become experience, then the two may not be entirely separate. They may be part of the same process. Now, as you lie here, listening, drifting between thought and stillness, you might notice something subtle, that your experience is not passive. You're not simply receiving a fixed stream of events. Your attention shifts, your perception changes, your awareness highlights certain aspects of the world, while others fade, and in doing so, it shapes the reality you experience, not the external structure of the universe, but the version of it that becomes present to you. And this is where the idea of participation becomes very personal, because even if consciousness does not control reality, it clearly shapes experience. It determines what becomes part of your world and what remains unseen. And if the deeper layers of reality involve similar processes, of possibilities becoming actual, then consciousness, in its own quiet way, may be part of that unfolding, not as a force, not as a command, but as a presence, a participant. Now, we do not need to resolve this idea. It is enough to let it rest, gently, alongside the others, a possibility, a way of seeing that the universe is not entirely separate from awareness, but includes it in some subtle and profound way. And as we move toward the final part of our journey, we will begin to gather these ideas together, not to force a conclusion, but to reflect, to ask what it might mean, if even a small part of this is true, what it might suggest about your place in the universe, and about the quiet, ongoing mystery of being aware. As you rest here, perhaps feeling a little more distant from the urgency of the day, a little closer to that quiet space between waking and sleep, we arrive at the final part of our journey. Not a place of answers, but a place of reflection, because everything we have explored, from the smallest structures in the brain to the deepest layers of reality, leads not to a single conclusion, but to a widening sense of possibility. We began with something simple, the feeling of being you, a presence so familiar that it often goes unnoticed, and from there, we moved gently outward, asking how such an experience could arise from physical processes. We saw how classical science, for all its precision, still leaves a gap, a space where explanation becomes description, but not understanding. We explored the quantum world, where reality is not fixed, but open, where possibilities exist before becoming definite. We considered the idea that life, and perhaps the brain, may be able to work with these deeper patterns, and we followed a thread from microtubules to moments of awareness to the unity of experience. Along the way, we encountered uncertainty, skepticism, important challenges that remind us how much is still unknown, and this is where we now rest. Not at the end of a path, but at the edge of a horizon. Now, when we ask what this might mean, we can do so gently, without needing to decide, without needing to resolve every question. Instead, we can notice a few quiet implications. The first is about the nature of the self, If consciousness arises from processes that are not entirely fixed, not entirely predetermined, then your experience is not simply being replayed, it is unfolding, moment by moment, shaped by a subtle interplay between what is possible and what becomes actual. This does not mean that everything is uncertain or that the world lacks structure, but it suggests that there is room for openness, for variation, for emergence, and within that space, something like choice or agency may find its place, not as complete freedom, but as participation in a process that is not entirely rigid. Now, this idea connects, in a very soft way, to what we often call free will, not as an absolute power to control everything, but as a subtle influence within a system that is already in motion, a shaping rather than a commanding. Now, we must remain careful. This is not a proof, it is a possibility, a way of thinking about how openness at the deepest levels of reality might be reflected in experience. The second implication is about connection. If the boundaries between systems, between brain and world, are not entirely fixed, then the sense of separation we experience may be less absolute than it appears. This does not dissolve individuality. You remain yourself, with your own perspective, your own history, your own experience, but it suggests that you are also part of something larger, a pattern within a wider field, and that your awareness is not isolated, but shaped by and connected to the reality around you. Now, again, we remain grounded. This is not a claim that minds are directly linked or that information flows freely between them, but it is a gentle reminder that the boundaries we perceive are often softer than they seem. The third implication touches something even deeper, the possibility that consciousness is not an accident, not a byproduct of complexity alone, but something that may be rooted in the structure of reality itself, not necessarily present everywhere in the same way, but emerging when conditions allow as part of a deeper pattern. And if that is true, then your awareness, this quiet sense of being, is not separate from the universe. It is one of the ways the universe becomes present to itself. Now, this idea can feel large, so we hold it lightly, without needing to accept it or reject it, simply as a possibility, resting among others. Now, as we move toward the final moments, we can also look ahead, gently, to where this exploration might lead. In science, new tools are being developed, more sensitive instruments, new ways of observing the brain, of measuring patterns, of detecting subtle forms of coordination. There is growing interest in how different states of consciousness, such as meditation or altered perception, might relate to changes in brain activity. And in the field of technology, researchers are exploring systems that go beyond classical computation, systems that work with probabilities, with possibilities, in ways that echo the quantum world. Some wonder whether such systems could one day approach something like awareness, not by copying the brain, but by engaging with deeper processes. These ideas are still far from realization, and they remain uncertain, but they reflect something important, that the question of consciousness is not closed, it is evolving, expanding, becoming more refined as we learn more. Now, as you lie here, perhaps feeling your thoughts becoming lighter, your awareness more diffuse, you might notice that the need for answers is fading, and in its place, there is something quieter, a sense of presence, of simply being here, and perhaps that is enough. Because even without understanding everything, the experience itself remains, the gentle rhythm of your breath, the soft awareness of your body, the quiet flow of thought, rising and falling, and behind it all, the simple fact that you are aware. Now, as we come to the end of this exploration, we can let everything we've discussed settle, not as conclusions, but as impressions, as possibilities, resting lightly in the mind. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open, or you're already drifting somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for being part of this quiet journey. If you'd like to return to explore more gentle questions about the universe, the mind, and the space between them, you're always welcome here. For now, let the ideas fade like distant echoes. Let your thoughts slow and soften, and allow yourself to rest, because time, like everything else, moves gently forward. And in this moment, there is nothing you need to do but drift and sleep.